So first of all, welcome to the session. I think I'm now the last speaker between you and the award ceremony. So depending on your feelings about the award ceremony, this may be a good or bad thing. My name is Zulfikar Ramzan. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for RSA. And you can see this presentation is entitled Operationalizing the 3 Principles of Advanced Threat Detection. And I'm going to publicly admit something to you that I typically don't do when I start a presentation, which is tell you that I actually hate this title. Absolutely detest it. And the reason I hate it, well, the marketing team came up with it based on my talk track. And I want to talk to you about why I don't like this title, which I think is going to be in and of itself pretty informative in terms of how I look at the overall security landscape. So the first word I don't like about this title is the word advanced. And the reason I don't like it is it makes it seem like we're talking about something that's kind of out there, that's cutting edge. And the reality is that what people consider advanced today is not the same thing they considered advanced 5 years ago. In fact, what's kind of happened is what was considered advanced 5 years ago is now pretty much what's normal today. And so from that perspective, the term advanced has kind of lost its meaning. To me, advanced is the stuff we typically see. So it's no longer just advanced. The second thing I don't like about this title is the idea of this 3 principles. Now, this is a very marketing type title. They always like to put 3 somethings or other you're going to learn. And what I don't like about it is it sort of limits what we have to do in security. Security is not a 3 principle kind of problem. It's not like you do 3 things and you're secure. The reality is those 3 things may be part of an overall security strategy. So I'm going to talk about what I think some of the key areas are, and then tell you about what some of the connective tissue is to make those areas work together. And the final thing I don't like about this title, there's 3 things I hate about this title, then I'll be done complaining about the title, which is the notion of the focus on threat detection. And to me, that's a narrow focus because detection in and of itself is not sufficient for being able to deal with what we're dealing with. But you've got to look at detection as part of an overall strategy. In other words, if you focus on detection in isolation, it's a mistake. But you've got to look at detection as part of a triumvirate of prevention, response, and detection kind of being together. And so I want to make sure that those things are not lost when you look at a title like this. So I'm going to talk about the 3 principles of advanced threat detection over the course of the next 40 to 45 minutes. Now, before I kind of dig into the things that are typically complicated, I want to show you a picture of what our industry looks like today. There you go. Sorry I could not make the font much bigger. Hopefully the size of the font is indicative of the problem we're dealing with. Now, this is actually not a full landscape assessment. When you look at the security landscape, it is incredibly complex. You've all walked around today. You've seen a lot of vendors. There's probably about another 1,400 or 1,500 vendors you did not see today. Okay? And the reality is most of the vendors in the space of this 1,500, and depends on what you consider security, what you don't consider security. Some of these vendors may work in different areas. In fact, depending on who you ask, there may be dozens or many dozens of different types of industry variations. And it turns out that most of these companies on this list have minimal revenue. Maybe it's less than 10 million or 20 million in revenue. In fact, I think 90+% of the companies on this list would be in that category. And so we're dealing with a highly complex space, a space in which there's a lot of companies out there that claim to solve it to some degree, a space that, as we all know, probably doesn't have that many experts in it to really solve the problem effectively, let alone 1,500 or 1,600 experts to do it effectively. And so I think that's created a problem in the market. When you look at the market and security about 10 to 15 years ago, the market was dictated by basically 2 technologies, the firewall and antivirus. Obviously, things have come a long way since then. And yet, I think in many ways, we spent all this money on security technologies, and the reality is that we're kind of in the middle of what I think of as a massive hot mess. And so that's kind of that's a really nice marketing slide, by the way. I think I'm going to give them credit for coming up with that animation. But I think hopefully it spells a point that the market we're looking at today is one where we're spending a lot of money, we're seeing a lot of technology out there. Quite frankly, most of the technology sounds the same at some point. You know, if you're a security practitioner today, and you're going out on the show floor here, and you're looking at what's out there, after a while, every white paper reads identically, probably because they're saying pretty much the same things. And of course, the reality is that not everybody does the same things, even though people may all say they do the same things. A lot of companies out there are basically taking features and they're calling them products. So, you know, not to bash on something like machine learning, which I see everywhere, machine learning and AI, that's a feature. That's part of a product overall, but it's not in and of itself a product. It's not a technology. It's a single feature of something much more rich. And if you have people focusing too much on features, there's a good chance you're not solving a problem in a more holistic fashion, which is what we need today. The second thing is that you have, in many cases, products that are masquerading as companies. Again, it's a similar situation where you may have a single product, it solves a certain set of problems, but it doesn't solve a lot of other problems that need to have solved in a security setting. And yet, oftentimes, you get confused about what the product can or cannot do, and that confusion is often due to the vendor community saying that, hey, our product can solve world peace, it can cure the common cold, it can establish X, Y, and Z. The reality is that very few products can do that. In fact, no products can do that. It's usually an amalgamation of the right products. And the last problem I see right now with the industry is that you have companies masquerading as businesses. As I mentioned, most of the companies on that list I showed you were not profitable. Many of them were very early in revenue. And most of them are not going to be around for a while. They're not going to be able to maintain this type of pattern where they spend $1.50 for every dollar they make. At some point, that is going to go away. And so these three situations, the fact that you've got features masquerading as products, products masquerading as companies, and ultimately companies that are not going to be around for a long time, that is, I think, the core problem we're dealing with today in the industry that's different from the problems people typically talk about. And I want to focus today on problems that people don't typically talk about because you've all heard about the stuff that everyone cares about and talks about all the time. Now, moving a step further, when you look at the technologies that are out there, it's pretty clear that you've got all these companies. Okay, not all of them are going to survive. Let's say that in any given year, you see about 125, maybe 130 M&A deals. Somebody gets acquired by somebody else. At RSA, which, as you know, is part of EMC, which just got bought by Dell. So we are in a world where there's consolidation happening in the market. But most of these companies out there, these 1,500, they're not going to get bought in the next year. Most of them are not going to IPO. And when you work out the math, let's say about 120, 130 M&A deals per year, maybe about 5 or so IPOs per year, and that's pretty generous, you end up with about 12 years of market overhang, which is a problem because most of these companies, as I mentioned, are pre-revenue, which means they're still relying on venture capital investment. And most venture capital investment, as you probably know, being in this sort of Greater Bay Area, is designed to last you about 12 months, maybe 18 months, 24 tops, before you get into real trouble. And so I think we're going to be in a situation where there'll be a bit of a falling out in the industry. I think we're going to have, already we have a lot of confusion, and that's only going to perpetuate. It's only going to get worse. Now, if that's not bad enough, the reality is that everything we're spending on today is not working the way we want it to work. Okay, you can just go out to the hallway and everybody will tell you that. The reality is that, and we did a survey, we found out that the customers we talked to, 70% said that they'd been compromised at some point in the last year. Most of them saw incidents grow year over year to the tune of 66%. Going one step further, it turns out that more than half the companies out there are not satisfied with their ability to detect an attack. And so they feel that ultimately they're spending all this money, but more than half the time they're not seeing the attacks that are coming into their infrastructure. And if that's not bad enough, even if they do see the attack, 9 out of 10 say they can't respond fast enough. They're not happy with how fast they're responding. And that's a serious problem. And when you couple all that together, the good news is that at least people out there, in fact, 8 out of 10 CISOs we talk to, are planning to rethink their security strategy in the next 12 to 18 months. And that's refreshing. That's not something we've heard historically. Historically, we've seen people spend a lot of money on technology, and that technology doesn't work, and then they keep spending money on the same approach. We're finally in a situation now where people are recognizing that the model has been fundamentally broken for some time, but they're finally realizing that they have to rethink their strategy in light of the fact that the model has been broken. Now, there's a lot of problems people talk about that lead to situations like this. I talked about the industry being more complex. Certainly, we know there's a shortage of cybersecurity professionals. People talk about that at length. People talk about the notion that there's too many alerts. It's impossible to possibly deal with all of them. I'm not going to focus on those issues. People also talk about the fact that there is an evolution in the threat landscape, that attackers are getting more sophisticated. In fact, we got some new threat intelligence recently about a new threat actor. His name is Pale Hippo 1. Apparently he weighs about 400 pounds. I'm told he normally hacks from his bed, occasionally from his couch. First intelligence reports came on the evening of the 26th of September. Anybody watching the presidential debate probably realized where this came up. And he's very politically motivated from what I can tell. But seriously, what's interesting about this is that even though I'm kind of making this example up, it turns out that Pale Hippo 1 today can probably do what a nation state could have done about 5 years ago, right? So there's been this collective evolution of threats, which to me is what I think is more worrisome. We often get caught up in the latest, greatest, most complex threat out there. We forget that it's the average threat that matters most. That's what people deal with on a regular basis. And if Pale Hippo 1 can all of a sudden do this kind of thing where it doesn't have to be a nation state, that's a serious problem for us. Now, there's one more problem people don't often talk about, and this is what's going to be the focus of my presentation. I don't want to talk about the stuff people do talk about. I want to talk about something a bit new, which I like to term the gap of grief. And here's the idea behind the gap of grief. If you look at the role of information security today, it's drastically changed compared to 5 or 10 years ago. So show of hands, how many people have been in the industry for about 5 years as practitioners or more? Anybody 10 years or more? We all remember a time where people didn't really care about what we did when we were security practitioners, right? When you were a security practitioner 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you were somewhere relegated to a corner of the IT department, and as long as you did your job well, nobody bothered you, and once in a while when people did bother you, it was because of some major issue that occurred. But that role has changed significantly. We're seeing it be the case now more and more that typical security professionals, security practitioners, are required to present to CEOs, to boards of directors, to upper management. There's a lot more interest from the top down when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, for a long time, I kind of wished this would be the case, right? For a long time, I was working in security and nobody really cared about this field. And now all of a sudden, it has become massively popular. The mainstream cares about security. And it's kind of a be careful what you wish for moment, right? All of a sudden, we've got to justify what we do to the highest levels of an organization. We've got to justify what we do to CEOs, to boards of directors, to CFOs. In fact, when I talk to our customers, this comes up all the time. They tell me that, for the first 15 years of their career, they didn't even know who was on the board of their company. And now they're presenting to their board every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or every couple of months. And I've seen this myself personally. For the first 15 years of my career, I don't think I met a single CEO. And in the last couple of years, I've been invited back to Harvard Business School twice to give lectures on cybersecurity to executives. I've been asked to meet with CEOs, with boards, and they genuinely care about the problem that we're dealing with. But having said that, there's a bit of a reality check here that as security practitioners, we historically didn't know how to talk to the board about security issues. You see, we were focused on things like whether or not the Angular toolkit exploited a vulnerability in Internet Explorer that caused the breach to happen. Or we were obsessed with concepts like SQL injections and cross-site scripting and whatnot. The reality is the board of directors or CEO don't really care about the low-level technical details. They typically want to understand the impact at a business level. What was actually taken? How long were the bad guys in there? Is there an intellectual property impact? Is there a business continuity impact? How about a regulatory compliance impact? And it turns out this distinction between what security practitioners have typically been taught to provide and what CEOs and boards want to hear, that is this gap of grief. That is a massive chasm that we have to address in our industry. And I think it only begins there. I think it can actually get a lot worse. Because the reality is that a lot of the questions that a CEO will ask, things like, when did you first get breached? Or what was taken? These questions are deceptively easy to ask, but they are horrendously complex to answer unless you have the right plumbing in place to make those decisions, unless you know that you've got to be able to answer those questions. It's very difficult during a breach or during a complex scenario to be able to come up with answers like that. And it's even harder to explain to somebody who's not technical that, hey, even though this question sounds really easy, it's actually really complex. And I want to focus on this particular gap of grief. Now, look, I go to a lot of security talks, and typically what I hear in a lot of talks is people talk about why the world is falling apart, why the sky is falling, et cetera. Then they go off the stage, and that's it. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to talk about all the problems we're having without telling you a bit about what I think we need to do moving forward. So with that, I want to kind of begin talking about what we need to do moving forward. But I want to tell a quick story in the meanwhile. And this story is based on the events of the Olympics. And we know we're just in the Olympic year this year. It's a nice high jumper. His name is Dick Fosbury. Does anybody know who Dick Fosbury is? Usually I get a few people. Okay, so Dick Fosbury was a high jumper in the US in the 1960s. And by his own admission, he was even interviewed and asked this, he said that he was horrible. He sucked at high jumping. In fact, he said he was probably one of the worst people on his team, if not the worst person on his team at the high jump. Now, what's interesting is Dick Fosbury was a high jumper during a very interesting period in high jump history. You see, when Dick Fosbury had started high jumping, your typical high jump platform had sawdust pits at the bottom. And if you can imagine that for a moment, it's not very comfortable to land on a sawdust pit after you've jumped up over a bar. And so as a result, the typical high jump would rely upon somebody essentially landing in a very comfortable position when they landed on that sawdust pit. Now, over the course of the 60s, people started to replace those sawdust pits with the typical mats we see today that are much more comfortable to land upon. And what Dick Fosbury realized is, you know what, if we're changing the way that the mat looks, if we're landing on a more comfortable place, why not rethink how I do my jump? And so we started experimenting with new techniques, one of which now bears his name, called the Fosbury flop, which is exactly what you see him doing right there, which is essentially jumping almost shoulders first. It's a very awkward way of doing things, but it turns out it actually distributes your center of gravity to the point that you can actually get much higher and you can stay in the air a lot longer. So he took a different perspective, and it turns out that this perspective was so valuable that it won him the gold medal at the 1968 Olympics. Now, the key to this story is he was willing to change his perspective in relation to what was going on in the world around him. And I think we've got to do the same thing when it comes to cybersecurity. We often take the same perspective over and over again. We often look at the world the same way, but we're dealing with a highly dynamic situation. Threat actors are evolving, they're changing. Pale Hippo 1 is going to come out today. I'm sure there'll be a Pale Hippo 2 tomorrow, or a new nation state, or a new vulnerability, or a new zero day. And if we're not evolving our thinking, we're going to be left on the wayside. Now, I think there are three key areas in which we've got to think about and evolve our thinking, and they turn out to be some of the most fundamental pillars of security. And these pillars are, number one, analytics, number two, identity, and number three, risk. And I'm going to talk about what each does and what the implications of each are over the course of the second half of this presentation. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with analytics. Now, the precursor to analytics in general is having visibility. Visibility is the foundation for mitigating the risk of today's threats. If you cannot see it, you cannot protect it, right? It's as simple as that. If you have no idea what's going on in your network, there's no hope whatsoever of being able to detect or prevent that situation from occurring again. Now, you can take my word for it, or you can ask probably the most experienced hacking organization on the planet, the one that's able to basically get into any system whatsoever, what they think. And in fact, it turns out we can actually ask them because Rob Joyce, who's the head of NSA's Tailored Access Operations Group, this is the group, by the way, that basically hacks for a living, went to a conference called the Unix Enigma Conference in 2016, and you can find a YouTube video of him presenting at the conference. And I would encourage you to watch it. It's a really enlightening video. And he says in that conference that if you really want to protect your network, you really have to know your network. You have to know the devices, the security technologies, and the things inside it. And he's basically telling you that if you want to make his life harder, as the NSA's TAO chief, the way to do it is by having visibility. I think it goes to show how important visibility is. Ultimately, security comes down to some level of information superiority. If there's information asymmetry, if the attacker knows something you don't, they can exploit that asymmetry in a way that's to your detriment. That's how we start with visibility, but it turns out that there's different elements of it from a tactical perspective. And what are some of the key points of visibility that matter the most? So in my mind, the key areas are the traditional ones, certainly logs, NetFlow, packets, being able to understand what's happening at your network level. And a lot of people may collect this data, but not everybody uses it. I know a lot of folks who collect logs, but they never look at those logs. People who may look at flow data occasionally, people who collect packet data. One step beyond that, I think, is endpoint. This is an area which, quite frankly, if I went to a customer meeting about 5 years ago and talked about endpoint agents, the meeting probably would have ended in about 30 seconds with me being escorted out of the room, because nobody wanted to hear about putting an endpoint agent anywhere. And yet now I think we've evolved some of our thinking. We know that, you know what, the endpoint is often the scene of the crime. It's often where something bad is happening, and therefore we need some level of visibility into what's happening at the endpoint level. Much like if you were trying to figure out how a particular robbery took place, and you only had surveillance footage from a satellite, that would tell you maybe a certain level of detail, but not very much. The most granular detail would happen from a surveillance camera on the ground at the scene of the crime itself. It takes a lot of the guesswork away, but it certainly costs more because you've got to make sure you have that capability in place. But the cost is now, I think, to the point where the benefits are so much greater and the cost is so minimal that it's worth doing anyway. Cloud's becoming a new area for us. I think it's an area where, in many ways, we've heard about it over and over again. And I think the mistake people will make with cloud is they kind of still view it as an abstract notion. To me, the cloud is a fundamental extension of your enterprise infrastructure. Right? It's also an extension of your enterprise infrastructure to which you have the least visibility, because oftentimes you can access a cloud application or a cloud service hosted by a third party off your network on perhaps a BYOD device. And when you combine all that, it does create a massive visibility gap that has to be considered. Then finally, I want to point out identities, because this is an area where people often stop when it comes to visibility. They kind of focus on the actual infrastructure itself. But at the end of the day, every attack at some point involves a person or an entity, an actual identity in the system. And unless you know which identities accessed what resources at what times, it's very difficult to be able to piece together the elements of the attack. And it's important to be able to piece together the elements of an attack. In fact, there's a law in cybersecurity which I call Tyson's Law. Tyson's Law is named after the well-regarded, famous cybersecurity researcher and boxer, Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson said, and I quote, or apparently he said, it may be apocryphal for all I know, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Right? When you think about this for a moment, this is our industry. This is cybersecurity, right? If you're dealing with a breach, that is the punch in the face. Talk about trying to execute your breach response plan when you first have to deal with it. Most people think they have a plan that works until they've got to finally implement it for the first time. In that case, it's important to ask yourself, what did you want to accomplish during that breach? What did you want to accomplish in terms of dealing with your board and communicating externally? What are the key questions that you have to be able to answer in the aftermath of a breach or during a breach? And do you have the capabilities to be able to answer that question effectively? That's part of your plan, right? That's the part that people often miss. The plan looks great on paper, but in practice, it doesn't work out quite right. And by the way, I think the worst situation to be in legally, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me on this from a legal perspective, but I think that any lawyer will probably tell you that, hey, if you had a plan and you could implement it, that's the worst situation to be in, because now you've lost element of plausible deniability. All of a sudden, you've admitted you knew what the right thing was to do, and you decided not to do it anyway. In fact, in many cases, it's better not to have a plan at all than to be able to have a plan that you can implement. But I think the ideal thing is to be able to know what you want to do, know your objectives, and then work your way backwards. Now, I focus here on visibility because that's the foundation. Visibility is what enables you to actually carry out plans. It's what enables you to make intelligent decisions. But visibility by itself is not useful unless it's accompanied by some form of analytics. Analytics is what enables you to operationalize visibility. Visibility alone is going to cause you to deal with alert fatigue. You're going to have this data lake or this data landfill full of logs and packets and flow data and endpoint data, but you can't do anything useful with it unless you know how to extract meaningful insights from that data. And there's 5 key things you can be able to do to extract meaningful insights. So the first is being able to pre-process that data. Oftentimes we just take that data and we store it somewhere and then try to look at it later. But if you're not extracting intelligent metadata, if you're not extracting the things that matter most from that data up front, it's going to be very hard to analyze that data after the fact. The second thing is it's important to be able to group those alerts together. Oftentimes, a single incident may have multiple alerts behind it. For example, there may be a single threat actor implementing an attack on your network, and that attack might start off with a piece of malware. It might then involve some level of lateral movement. It might involve additional compromises, maybe the exploitation of certain vulnerabilities, certain command and control traffic. Now, if you treat each of those incidents separately, if you treat each of the events that occur separately, then there's a good chance that your analyst team will not be able to deal with this attack holistically. There'll be gaps of communication and be silos that don't have to be there. The third element is being able to pivot between different elements of your infrastructure. And this is a subtle point, but I think it's important. Think about your typical attack today. Let's say, for example, you start off and you notice that, hey, there's some weird command and control traffic going over my network. Maybe your IPS detected it, or maybe you had a threat intelligence feed that told you that this particular IP address was no good. What do you do next? Typically, you want to know, okay, which person was responsible for that traffic? What endpoint? The next question is, okay, what actually happened on that endpoint? What was the actual underlying process on that endpoint that generated that traffic? And by the way, how did that process get there? And do I see similar processes on other endpoints in my environment? Now, what I'm doing is I'm starting off with the individual instance, the individual event, and I'm working my way down to uncover the details of the underlying attack, because a single attack may have multiple events associated with it. And so being able to pivot between network and endpoint, being able to pivot between the different aspects of your infrastructure, that's what enables you to really understand the underlying attack given just a single event that occurred. The next thing is to be able to surface important events based on analytics, being able to find out what the most important elements are so that your analyst team isn't stuck in the dark. When they first show up in the morning, so to speak, with their cup of coffee, proverbially, they want to be able to find the most interesting events to look at. And that's something that we can surface through the right analytics. But finally, which events do you attack first? This is a subtle question. It's something we don't often talk about. We treat every event like they're equal. And that's a huge mistake. In fact, look at all the major breaches that occurred in the last 24 months. Most of those companies that got breached typically had IPS, they had firewalls, they had SIM, they had antivirus, they had everything you could imagine, and yet they got breached. And they got breached not because they had zero visibility into what was happening in their environment. They got breached because they knew too much. They were getting too many alerts. The problem was that for every 5,000 alerts that were useless, there was one in there that actually should have been followed up upon. How do you know that right one? And the key to that, I think, largely is being able to understand the asset being targeted. Okay, was that asset a production server that causes a business continuity impact? Was it a server that contained intellectual property? Was it a server that had a compliance implication, like a point of sale terminal? Was it a system that might contain customer data on it, causing a different bifurcation in how you deal with the breach? Or was it a server that contained a PDF of the lunch menu in the cafeteria? Now you might say, okay, well, that doesn't happen in real life. It actually kind of does, right? Most people look at these alerts, they don't sort them by what's meaningful. They treat every alert like it's the same thing. And if you do that, there's a good chance, in fact, it's almost certain you're going to miss the most critical alert in your system. You're not going to handle what matters most. You're going to typically handle things that are unimportant to the business and fail to tackle the things that are most important. And that's why I think this notion of being able to drive your objectives by understanding the overall business outcomes you want to achieve, that's why it's so important. That's why we have this gap of grief, because traditionally we haven't really focused on the parts of the attack that matter most to us. So now I've talked about visibility for a while. The second thing I want to talk about is identity. And identity in many ways is foundational. It will matter even more, I think, as the threat landscape evolves. And the reason I think it's foundational is that security has always been about ensuring that only the right people have access to the right resources at the right times and can do the right things with that access. It's such a basic statement, but when you think about it for a moment, every security problem does boil down to being able to satisfy this assertion. And by the way, I don't think you can satisfy this assertion unless you have a strong notion of identity in your environment, unless you have good, robust identity management capabilities. And I think right now in the enterprise setting and in the SLED setting and in the government setting, we have a massive identity crisis. And I call it the enterprise identity crisis, but it applies across the board to any organization. In fact, there's been some studies done. So according to Gartner, first of all, most organizations today are driving towards a cloud-first strategy. In other words, if they already own some kind of cloud service today, and they're looking to do any form of future IT procurement, their first goal is to do that procurement with a cloud-based solution. So as we see more cloud-based solutions being adopted, as we see more and more mobile devices proliferating in the network, identity starts to become the only thing we can hang on to from a security perspective. Effectively, it becomes the new perimeter. The second concept is that organizations, in many cases, have legacy identity architectures and employ islands of identity. In fact, according to ESG, 1 in 4 IT professionals said their organizations have multiple identity repositories, making it difficult to get a complete understanding of user access and user privileges. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, we all have, let's say, identities in the company. We have an email account. We've got a line somewhere in Active Directory saying who we are. And let's say I leave a company. Maybe I get my line removed from Active Directory. I lose certain access privileges. But what about the access privilege to that wiki account I created internally that's not part of Active Directory? What about that SaaS service that I may have used my email address for? When you take a step back, it's clear that there's a lot of aspects of identity that aren't covered by a traditional monolithic Active Directory view of identity, but in fact have to be examined separately and typically end up not being examined at all. And that's what I mean by the notion of islands of identity. In fact, I was talking to one of our customers. He was in the board of directors of a company, and he had left his board position, and he told me that 1 month after he left his board position, he received an email with the minutes of the last board of directors meeting. And he was no longer with the company, so we kind of wondered why that happened. And it turns out that when he joined the board, he had given his personal email address as the email to which minutes were to be sent. So sure enough, when the next minutes came out, they were sent directly to his email. And now, by the way, he's somewhat liable because now he's in possession of critical company information. Luckily, he was able to sort this out, but this kind of things happen all the time. In fact, I had it happen to me once personally where I'd left a company, and in fact, because of a merger, I had actually had 2 email accounts. And one of my email accounts got disabled correctly, the other one didn't. So I kept getting invites to meetings, which was kind of annoying. What was not so annoying maybe is I got a paycheck again in the mail 2 weeks later. Turns out I can't cash it, otherwise I get in legal trouble. So I had to tell the company, hey, by the way, guys, you know what? FYI, I left about 3 weeks ago. Maybe you shouldn't send me a paycheck anymore. True story. You can ask me afterwards which company it was. I won't say it in public. Maybe give me beer first before you ask me. But you know what? There's a lot more to threats than malware. I think we often focus on malware because it's the most interesting thing. It's the most exciting aspect of security in many ways. It's the most scintillating, but the reality is there's much more to threats than malware. First of all, a lot of breaches don't have to involve malware at all. You could have a SQL injection that involves then setting up a web shell afterwards. Then you can do RDP from that web shell, and all of a sudden you can move laterally. Intrusions can be very simple. In fact, they may be rooted in some form of credential theft. In fact, if you look in the news, some of the most massive intrusions we hear about, the ones where hundreds of millions, literally hundreds of millions of accounts are stolen, are often rooted in a single password being lost. And in some cases, what might happen is the attacker might use malware to get in, and then you know what deletes the malware? It's not antivirus software. It's the attacker himself deletes the malware because he doesn't need it anymore, and he starts using other resources and credentials to get through the network. So typically, malware is only one small element, one small sliver of the overall attack. And at the end of the day, every breach at some point involves co-opting an identity at some point. It involves being able to take that identity and doing something more nefarious with it than was originally planned. And so I think the key lesson here is that identities is, number one, it's a big problem. It's also broad. It's way more than just authentication itself. Now you might be surprised to hear somebody at RSA say that identity is way more than authentication, but it's true. I think there's many aspects of identity that are transcending authentication. So for example, there's governance, there's lifecycle, there's access and authentication, certainly, there's assurance. And these things all go hand in hand. Now, a great example of this might be something like a conference. Let's say the RSA conference, which happens once a year in the Bay Area. You know, every year I go to the conference, and me and a lot of other folks show up. And on the first day, we go and we go to the registration area, and we give our names, we give our IDs, and we get a badge in return. Somebody on the registration site knew that we were supposed to get that badge. They had our name somewhere in a database. It was a database record with my name in it. The process of setting up that database record in the first place, that is the process of governance. That's how do you set up the right rules to begin with. Then they give me my badge, and that badge lets me into certain areas depending on the kind of badge I have. If I have a full conference pass, which I usually have, I can pretty much get into any speaking session. I can go to the expo floor, but I can't go to the expo floor before the expo floor is open. In fact, the only people who can go to the expo floor before it's open are the people who have a special exhibitor pass, which gives them a certain set of privileges. But by the way, the exhibitor pass doesn't let you go into the actual sessions themselves. And so all of a sudden, identity is much more complex. There's different elements of it. Some people get an expo-only pass, which allows them into the expo floor, but not to any sessions during the main hours. But let's say I go to the expo floor, and I like the expo floor, and I go, you know what? I want to upgrade myself to a full conference pass. I can go, pay some money, and now get a full conference pass with the same credential. And by the way, that's life cycle. That's people's roles changing over time. In organizations, roles change all the time. People get promoted, people leave, people become full-time employees from contractors, or maybe they were an intern once, they became a full-time employee, or they were a medical student in a hospital and became an attending physician at some point and went through residency in between. or there was a reorg in the company. And so it turns out each of these elements is a lifecycle incident, and if you don't handle lifecycle correctly, this is where most mistakes are made in identity. Right? If you fail to handle the lifecycle question, you may leave somebody with an orphan account or a privilege they're not supposed to have, and that's typically the privilege that's exploited by most companies when it comes to somebody actually compromising their information. Now, the final piece of identity I want to talk about is identity assurance. So, I show up to the RSA conference every year, and inevitably I've been going now for many, many years, and I see somebody I know, maybe from another company or somebody I've known in a private engagement, and I'll start talking to them. And look, I don't ask them for their two-factor credential when I meet them. I don't ask them for their driver's license to verify who they are. I may know that I'm supposed to see them there. I know what they look like. I expect that they'll be on the conference on this date. I use a lot of other really basic pieces of information to be able to determine that someone is who they say they are without actually asking them for a credential. And that's the concept of identity assurance. Now, it turns out that we do this all the time without realizing it. Anybody who does online banking? Here's an interesting factoid. Your online bank doesn't care if your password's correct or not. Now, you might be shocked. What do you mean they don't care if my password's correct? They don't care because they assume that somebody else already knows your password. But what they do look at, what they care about more, is what do you do when you first log in? What IP address did you come from? What time of day did you log in? What did you do when you first logged in? It turns out that when you look at those subtle pieces of information, that is a much more reliable indicator of who you are than your password simply being correct. And I know this because at RSA we certainly work with a lot of banks to help them implement systems like this. And this is actually how the world's been doing authentication for a long time, even in the online setting. And I think we're going to start to see this notion of identity assurance move into the organizational world, into governments, into enterprises, because I think it's going to be a key part of making identity much more functional and practical. So the final topic I want to talk about is the idea of being able to embrace and own your risk. Now, first of all, I want to mention that we talk about risk in a security setting, and we've heard over and over again that security and risk are obviously very, very tightly tied together. But I bring this up because if you talk about risk at an organizational level, to the chief compliance officer, to the chief risk officer, they're thinking of risk in a much different way. Risk is a highly multifaceted topic. It is not a monolith, it's a mosaic. It's full of nuances and subtleties. There's enterprise risk, there's IT security risk, there's physical risk, like an earthquake, for example. There's regulatory risk, there's supply chain risk. It turns out that when we think of risk in a more holistic sense, IT security risk is certainly one element of that risk chain. It's probably the least understood, if not the most prominent element of that chain, but it's just one element of risk overall. Now, the key to being able to embrace and owning risk is being able to tie business context into underlying technical detail. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Things like being able to categorize assets, being able to find out which assets are the most meaningful, and being able to tie that into an incident. That's a very valuable thing to be able to do. Otherwise, you'll be in the situation I talked about earlier where there may be an incident occurring, an asset's been compromised, but without knowing if that asset is meaningful, it's hard to know how to progress, it's hard to know what to do next. So to me, I think risk is really what enables you to tie these pieces together. It's what you allow to put context around the overall incident itself. And so I think when you look at everything together, you can tie these pieces together towards a more holistic business-driven security strategy. And when I say business-driven, I really mean focusing on outcomes that are of interest to the higher level of the organization, not just outcomes that are typically of interest to people who are technologists or security practitioners. And to me, there's some key elements of business-driven security. We've got security exclusion, which I refer to by talking about visibility and analytics. You've got security inclusion, which is the opposite side. It's making sure that the bad guys not only stay out, but that the good guys are allowed in. And security inclusion can be handled through robust identity management capabilities. At the intersection of those two capabilities, you've got analytics. Now remember that when we talked about things like visibility and monitoring, analytics was an important component of that because visibility alone could not be useful unless you use analytics to derive meaningful insights. In the identity world, we're seeing the same thing. In the identity world, with identity assurance, that's also predicated on being able to run the right analytics. Finally, you have orchestration and response that wraps around that so you can start to act on what's happening when you see an incident occur. Because if an incident occurs and you don't have an actual workflow to be able to deal with it, again, it's the wrong situation to be in. And when that workflow does occur, you want to make sure you've dealt with every single element of it, that you've really crossed every I, or I should have crossed every T and dotted every I. And then finally, you want to be able to wrap contextual information around this, where you can take low-level technical details and tie it back to the higher language and the overall needs of the organization. And if you do that effectively, you'll have a few key wins. You'll be able to see the right picture. You'll have power and speed of insight. You'll have deeper context from what's occurring. And finally, you'll be able to act correctly. And this comes up over and over again. The worst situation to be in is one where you know what you've got to do, but you can't actually do it. Where you have all the relevant data, but you can't act effectively. Okay, that's like the absolute worst situation. And I've seen it happen over and over again. I've seen people invest in things that give them visibility, but not in things that give them action. So the final thing I want to talk about, very subtle in just one slide, not my favorite topic, but I think it's one of the most relevant topics, and that's budget. Okay, budget's not a very exciting topic for most people, myself included. And what I've typically seen when it comes to security spending is that most people focus their spending on prevention-based technologies. And that's been an historical artifact. We've bought firewalls and antivirus for a long time. But if we've learned anything from all the major breaches in the last few years, it's that people who are even moderately sophisticated, Pale Hippo 1 and other actors like him, are able to get past those first lines of defense. It's a routine thing for them. And if they can get past the first line of defense, the goal becomes how can you do effective detection and response? Now, by the way, I want to point out this is not capitulating anything. The reality is that a threat actor, their goal is not to compromise your system. Their goal is to get after some critical data. The system itself is basically a means to an end. Much like if you had a bank robber, the goal of the bank robber is not to walk in the front door of your bank. The goal of a bank robber is to get the money in the vault. And it turns out that it's not easy just to get the money in the vault after you've walked in the bank. Now, look, I watch a lot of shows on television that have to do with cybersecurity. One of my favorites is Mr. Robot. Does anybody watch Mr. Robot? Okay, fantastic technical content. But the one thing that show gets wrong is the speed of the attack. Okay, in one episode, these guys literally break in, they get the most critical assets, and they're out the door in 1 hour. Okay, that doesn't happen in real life. Okay, in real life, it may take months. Somebody might break in on day one. It might take them 4 to 6 months, maybe even 9 months to find the most critical asset, which means there's a fantastic window of opportunity for effective detection and response. And that's the opportunity we have to take advantage of. And we can only take advantage of that opportunity if we allocate our budget in the right way. So rather than allocating it heavily towards prevention, my suggestion is to have a more equitable split. Split between detection, response, and prevention. And make sure you cover three all equitably. Now, by the way, the world is moving in this way. In fact, Gartner predicts that by 2020, organizations are going to spend at least 60% of their budget on detection and response. So we already are seeing a much more equitable split. I think it's going to even out at some point because the reality is prevention-based technologies aren't able to accomplish what we want. We've got to focus not just on prevention, but on connecting with detection and response and having a complete triumvirate. So with that, I want to offer 3 key takeaways because I'm told that in any talk, you have to have 3 key takeaways. So here they are. And then after these takeaways, you're free to go out to the award ceremony, which I think is going to start in about 10 minutes. So the first key takeaway is that deep and pervasive visibility is your foundation. Okay? Without visibility, you can't do a lot. But without analytics, you can't operationalize visibility. So focus on visibility, but make sure you have analytics in conjunction with it to make meaningful decisions. The second key takeaway is to have a comprehensive identity strategy. Have clear lines of ownership and responsibility. That has to be part of your overall strategy. In fact, in a lot of companies I talk to, the people who own identity typically never talk to the people who deal with security. And yet, identity is the most consequential attack vector out there. So being able to address that gap, being able to have some level of ownership, or at least some level of being at the table, is going to be paramount for most organization success. Then finally, security is not just a technical issue anymore. It's an issue that's at the intersection of technology, of business, and of risk. And unless you think about security and that broader business context, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to deal with the way the world is moving forward. Boards, executives, mission stakeholders, senior management in any company, ultimately they care the most about the language of risk. And unless you can speak to people in the language of risk, you're not going to be able to make progress from a security perspective. So it's absolutely critical to embrace and own your risk, ultimately. I think if you embrace and own this new reality from a security perspective, if you embrace and own the fact that the world has changed, you'll be in a better position moving forward to make meaningful and important decisions that can literally impact the lives of everyone who relies upon you. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time. I hope you guys have a great award ceremony, and I'm around afterwards if you want to find out what company gave me a paycheck and wasn't supposed to. Thanks a lot.